How is self-determination foundational to achieving Palestinian human rights? What are the mechanisms and consequences of its denial? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode of Connections, we're delighted to be speaking with Francesca Albanese. Francesca Albanese is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian Territory Occupied in 1967. She is an affiliate scholar of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University and a senior advisor on migration and forced displacement for the think tank Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, ARDD, where she co-founded the Global Network on the Question of Palestine. Albanese has published widely on the legal situation in Israel-Palestine. Her latest book, Palestinian Refugees and International Law, published by Oxford University Press in 2020 and co-authored with Lex Tackenberg, offers a comprehensive legal analysis of the situation of Palestinian refugees from its origins to modern-day reality. She previously worked as a human rights expert for the United Nations, including for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. Francesca Albanese, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for having me, Mouin.
Let me start by asking you, what is a United Nations Special Rapporteur? What are its role and responsibilities? In your specific case, what is your mandate? When and why was this position created? And when and by who were you appointed?
Yeah. Okay, special rapporteurs are independent human rights experts appointed by the Human Rights Council as part of the so-called special procedures, which are mechanisms established to report and advise on human rights from a thematic point of view, right to food, right to water, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, or human rights defenders, or, as in my case, on country-specific perspectives. In my specific case, the mandate is focused on the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories that Israel has occupied as of 1967. This mandate was created in 1993. And since then, it has had a number of experts serving on a 6-year term. I was appointed in this position in March this year, and this is the first time ever a woman holds this position. So my mandate is to report on Israel, primarily on Israel's violations of human rights and humanitarian laws. So it includes a broad spectrum of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social issues relating to life in the occupied Palestinian territory. But of course, international law as a framework is broader and more intertwined and includes certainly international criminal law, which is, as you know, and everyone should know, very relevant to the current reality in the occupied Palestinian territory. Now, I would like to point out from the very outset that, as it's understandable from the very title of my mandate, there are some limitations that go with it. The first limitation is geographic, because I only deal with the occupied Palestinian territory, namely the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. So I cannot investigate the situation of Palestinian refugees outside of the occupied Palestinian territory, or the situation of the Palestinians, citizens of Israel. And the other limitation is temporal, because I can only look at the Palestinian situation as of 1967. This doesn't prevent me from looking back at the past to draw conclusions, but of course, it's part of the overall fragmentation of the question of Palestine. Now, in terms of how I execute my mandate, my reports are normally are due to be built upon country visits, as well as witnesses' testimonies, NGO reports, states' submissions, and academia's work. But as of for the past 15 or 16 years, special rapporteurs serving on this mandate have been prevented from accessing the occupied Palestinian territory by Israel. This, of course, hinders our work. I will try as much as possible to challenge this, and I need incredible support to make it happen.
But just to be clear, Israel prohibits you from visiting the territory for which you have been mandated by the United Nations to investigate the human rights situation there.
Correct, because Israel challenges the very nature of the mandate, although special rapporteurs until the years 2000, so until Richard Falk was appointed special rapporteur, special rapporteurs on the OPT have been allowed in. John Dugard was able to visit the territory. And then Israel changed approach and now says that there is an inner bias of this mandate, which is an expression of an inner bias of the United Nations toward toward Israel, an excessive scrutiny toward Israel. I challenge this, but this is Israel's position.
And there's also, I believe, a separate special commission which has been in existence since the late 1960s, which has never been granted access to the occupied territories by Israel.
Yeah, the Special Committee on Israeli Practices was appointed, I think, in 1970. I mean, in the 1970s, and yes, it's not been granted access. Together with other commission of inquiries that have been appointed, including the current one that was appointed after the incidents, the facts of May 2021. So the war, another war on Gaza, the violence against worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the violence against Palestinians in Israel. And so there is a commission of inquiry now appointed by the Human Rights Council, and it has an interesting mandate because for the first time it can look at the root causes of violence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem, but also in Israel. And looking at the root causes means not being bound by 1967.
This is a three-person special commission consisting, I think, of a former Secretary General of Amnesty International, a prominent Australian jurist, and a third person whose identity escapes me for the moment.
The former High Commissioner for Human Rights and Judge Navi Pillai on the Rwanda Tribunal. And it's an extraordinary commission, but of course.
And like you, these are appointed by the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva.
Human Rights Council.
Or Human Rights Council, sorry.
Correct.
So getting back to your own work, you've just published your first report as Special Rapporteur, in which you focus on the right to self-determination, or perhaps more accurately, the denial of this right. With so many other pressing issues in the occupied Palestinian territories, why did you choose to examine a right that concerns Palestinians everywhere, and not just those in the more limited territories relevant to your mandate, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip?
First of all, as I said, by the terms of my mandate, I cannot look at the situation experienced by all Palestinians. So I have this territorial limitation, but why self-determination in particular, with all the violations that are occurring on an everyday basis, which are very important. And by the way, the reports I present twice a year, once to the General Assembly, as in this case with the report on self-determination, and one in March to the Human Rights Council, are an opportunity to report on the facts, and they try to keep to offer a broader picture of the reality in the OPT, but there are also other opportunities that I have to raise awareness and to try to create space for dialogue on this reality and raise awareness. So I do not intend to miss the details and of what unfolds in terms of the brutality of the occupation, the arrest and detention, and the excessive use of force, the dispossession, the displacement. And I do address it regularly in the course of my mandate. At the same time, the reason why I chose to focus on the right of self-determination is because this right is the platform right that enables the full enjoyment of every other right. In the report, I say this is the right of all rights, which belongs...
It's the foundation on which other rights can be achieved. Is that the way we should see it?
Exactly. It pertains to the Palestinian as a people, demographically, territorial, culturally, economically, and politically. All these very elements determine the existence and the preservation of a people and the protection thereof are denied to the Palestinians, particularly in the occupied Palestinian territory. Of course, as I made clear at the very beginning, I think from page 1 of my report, self-determination is a right that belongs to the Palestinian as a whole, wherever they are, being them in Israel or refugees wherever in the world. And at the same time, there is also a special case for the Palestinian in the occupied Palestinian territory, because this territory is recognized by international consensus as the territorial unity for the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination in the form of a state. This has been the international consensus for decades. So my report argues that Israel's regime in the occupied Palestinian territory as of 1967 has been intentionally acquisitive, segregationist and repressive. So for 55 years, Israel has disenfranchised the Palestinian people through force, abusive and discriminatory policy, and pillaging of resources. Israel has fragmented the Palestinian territory and caged the Palestinians into Bantustan, depriving them of freedom of movement, of opinion, of expression, to develop as a political constituencies, to develop as in terms of political leadership and cultural identity unrestrained, among other rights. So this is why I was saying it's the right to exercise the whole panoply of human rights. These policies are implemented with the ultimate goal of consolidating Jewish-Israeli majority rule over the native Palestinian majority in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the refugees who constitute 40% between Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. This implies de-Palestinization of the land and the denial of the Palestinian people's collective right to self-determination in what remains of the Palestinian ancestral land. And ultimately,
what others have referred to as the de-Arabization of the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, I don't think it's different. But again, I insist on the de-Palestinianization because and I've seen it with my own eyes while I was living in Jerusalem. There is a fight against the very existence of the Palestinian as a name, Palestinian as symbol, Palestinian as cultural and historical. In terms of historical symbols, there is an erasure and a seizure of all these, and these exposes the settler colonial underpinnings of the occupation. I think it's very important to acknowledge that because it leads to recognize the nature of Israel's predisposition vis-a-vis the Palestinian, and it's very clear that this needs to be absorbed particularly by governments in Western countries who insist on the mantra of the negotiation between the parties. They also insist on calling the current reality between the Israelis and the Palestinians as a conflict between two parties. It is not a conflict. It is an occupation where there is an intimate subordination of one to the other. There is an occupier and an occupied, the protected people. And
well, this is not a conflict between two states. It's not a territorial dispute between, let's say, two independent European states or something of that sort. This is a very clearly, as you put it, a settler colonial situation where one state is occupying a disenfranchised people. At the same time, in your report, you also raise some questions about using apartheid as an interpretive lens, because if I understand correctly, your view is that is in some respects problematic for missing some key points that self-determination does encompass. Could you explain that?
Yes. First of all, let me clarify one issue concerning the current relationship, and then I'll go back to my understanding and approach and possibly critique of the use of the apartheid framework. Because the situation on the ground is so illegal, we cannot expect, the Western countries cannot expect that the Palestinians are free to negotiate. This is why I say in the report they are asking the Palestinians to negotiate the legal, because as you said, state just occupying another state, like Russia occupying Ukraine, everything is clear. It's a war of aggression, so absolutely legal. But Israel, as of 1967, has occupied, built colonies, built an enterprise to profit from the presence of the colonies, exploiting resources, suppressing fundamental rights and freedoms on the way. So this is why I say this is incompatible with the right of self-determination. The overall conception of the occupation maintained for security reasons for 55 years is an aberration. And so moving to the apartheid discourse, of course, Israel is committing the crime of apartheid, as Yesh Din, Al-Haq, B'Tselem, OHCHR, and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International argue. Where I see the limitation is that somewhat the illegality of the occupation and the intention to occupy, to stay, is somewhat missing. So the natural consequence of abolishing apartheid as widespread and systemic discrimination entrenched in the laws and policies would lead to equality. But this would be jumping forward, moving fast forward, missing the opportunity to addressing the root causes, which is the settler colonial nature of Israeli presence in what remains of Palestinian territory. And this is why, again, and this is in a way epitomized by the way one of these reports on apartheid approaches the question of self-determination as something that needs to be negotiated, or the outcome of a political process. No, this is to be the precondition of a political process. The Palestinians cannot be asked to negotiate the terms of their subjugation. They need to be helped to liberate themselves from this subjugation.
Are you suggesting then that perhaps one of the problems with the apartheid paradigm is that it proposes remedies that can be implemented without addressing the fundamental political questions of occupation and self-determination?
No and yes, in the sense that ultimately it is at the very occupation regime as it exists for the Palestinian is incompatible with anything leading to the equality that the anti-apartheid or the post-apartheid scenario would entail. But the question of self-determination, yes, would be missing, because you can have a look at the situation of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's true that they are there and they enjoy more rights than those Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, or to many refugees refugees, particularly in the Arab region. But does it equate with the right of self-determination, which in a state would mean being recognized as a minority, culturally, politically? So it's a special protection regime based or hinging upon the recognition of a special status of a minority. Well, I think that this cannot be bypassed. These need to be addressed. Plus, I think that particularly in the dynamics between the Israelis and the Palestinians, any solutions to be sustainable need to unpack the deeply entrenched biases and trauma that is connected to the two people. And when it comes to the Palestinians, it means addressing the root causes, the enormous historical injustice they have suffered in connection with the creation of the State of Israel. So I don't think that we can really expect that equality will be granted without this awakening of consciousness takes place.
So turning back again to the question of self-determination, what are the main mechanisms through which Israel prevents the exercise of self-determination by the Palestinian people? And which of these are specific to Israeli practices in the occupied territories?
Let me start by saying that the right of self-determination is comprised, at least this is the way I've tried to articulate in the report, so as to create a link between how the right of self-determination is understood in international theory and practice, and how it trickles down or it doesn't for the Palestinians. So the right of self-determination comprises four main elements: territorial sovereignty, a political element, so the existence of, or the capacity of a people to exist as a political entity, so determine their political will and decide their political form. An economic element, meaning the capacity to, the possibility to benefit from the territorial resources, land, water, and oil and gas, anything that the land offers, so as to sustain the development and the self-sufficiency of the people. And then cultural rights, collective identity, the capacity to exist as a people and manifest that identity, that in the case of the Palestinians is their Palestinianness, with all the symbols that it entails, being it the flag or any cultural cultural signs. Of course, these four elements are interrelated, and Israel's frustrates each dimension, each component of the right of self-determination intentionally, progressively, and on a daily basis.
So you're talking here, I guess what you would argue is a comprehensive and systematic violation of the right and its individual components, or its constitutive components.
Yes. Yes, but it has been like that since the very beginning of the occupation. Because look at, for example, at the territorial component. The territorial sovereignty is an essential element to determine, to enjoy to the fullest the Palestinian territory, what remains of ancestral Palestinian homeland, as a territorial unity. And it has been targeted with strategic fragmentation. The fragmentation meaning the separation of the West Bank and Gaza, for example, that now it's so entrenched in everyone's mind that we do refer to the West Bank and Gaza as if they were two separate entities. Everyone it's very common to hear the West Bankers and the Gazans. No, they are the Palestinians from Western and the western and the eastern part of the occupied Palestinian territory. But this physical separation, hampered and actually amplified by administrative and military regimes that have been devised since 1967. And for example, the different ID cards, different car plates applied to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, East Jerusalem being de facto annexed. So there has been the territorial fragmentation and the separation of the people. Of course, this has also increased over time after Oslo, because the further fragmentation of the eastern part of the occupied territory into area A, B, and C has translated into a possibility to further acquisition of land and the construction and protection of Jewish-only colonies and the wall. So this is one manifestation of it. But of course, economically, culturally, this has followed suit. So, and of course, there is the containment of the Palestinian population into these heavily controlled reserves is at the core of the settler colonial goal to ensure demographic supremacy and prevent self-determination. Say it again?
Ghettoization, basically.
Yes, call it ghettos, calling Bantustan. But you know, there is a broader phenomenon of deprivation of liberty with different segregation regimes, basically, where, I mean, the most extreme is in Gaza, but it's not the only one.
Yeah. And you've already partially answered my next question, which is that while the persistence of occupation is an obvious consequence of the denial of self-determination, what are some of the other consequences that may be less immediately apparent? You mentioned territorial fragmentation, you mentioned the isolation of specific territories and so on. Are there certain other key features that we are perhaps insufficiently aware of, but that constitute a fundamental basic reality for Palestinians in the occupied territories?
Mouin, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
I was saying you've already partially answered my next question, which is that while the persistence of occupation is an obvious consequence of the denial of self-determination, what are some of the other consequences that constitute fundamental daily realities for Palestinians in the occupied territories that we may be less aware of? You mentioned territorial fragmentation. Are there also others that we should be more aware of?
Yes, I've analyzed each component, how each component is of the right of self-determination is violated. For example, the political component. I've investigated and reconstructed in the report the fact of the massive use of targeted killing and incarceration, particularly of political figures, of defenders and journalists and politicians. This has been a trend and is well documented if people take the time to read what is in the available literature. And now it has also exasperated, take the case of the persecution of civil society, human rights defenders, the criminalization of civil society, designated as terrorists. I mean, there is a use and abuse of anti-terrorism legislation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this is not uncommon in history, and in fact is very common to colonial regimes. Most of what I started to unpack, including in view of my next report, is how much of the British colonial presence in British mandate presence in Palestine has been retained, has sort of survived the change of regime, and is still applied in the occupied Palestinian territory.
Like the 1945 Defense Emergency Regulations and similar legislation?
I'm looking at that, yes, and I'm also looking at how in fact, this massive, there is if you look at the offenses and the sentencing framework that applies in the occupied Palestinian territory. I mean, the sentence for throwing stones, including when stones are thrown by children, it's unconscionable. It's critical to understand how Palestinians are accused as terrorists. Look at what is in fact the offense they commit, because this gives you the real picture of the regime that Israel is enforcing upon the Palestinians. And of course, there are other elements. The economic enterprise in the occupied Palestinian territory. Now, there are UN studies that report figures of how much Israel is profiting yearly, and it's causing loss in terms of GDP to the Palestinian economy by exploiting Palestinian resources, being the land, being water, or even oil and gas in Gaza. So the occupation is serving an economic purpose, let alone all the businesses that profit from the occupation.
And what's interesting in your report is that you basically draw a more or less direct connection between all these realities and violations on the one hand, and the denial of self-determination on the other. In other words, they're not only violations in and of themselves, but they're violations that are made possible by and derived from the denial of self-determination.
Yes. You know, something interesting is that I had decided to write this report about the right of self-determination because of what I found somewhat missing in the necessary and very compelling and commendable work of those who have exposed Israel's regime as an apartheid one, which is there. But I said the right of self-determination is the right of all rights, and it's not the case that eventually, by putting all these elements together like different pieces of a puzzle or linking all the dots, apartheid emerges as a consequence of the intention to establish and maintain control over the occupied territory, conduct which is in itself illegal, as a natural consequence, as an unavoidable consequence of this intention. It cannot be anything else than apartheid, because it takes a lot of violence to suppress people's freedom and rights in perpetuity, as Israel is trying to do. And of course, it entails a widespread and systemic violations of a panoply of rights. But we need to look at the intent, we need to look at the animus and keep the whole picture clear in mind, Mouin, because only by keeping the picture clear in mind, we will be able to devise a sustainable solution. Again, calling for democratic elections, calling for prosperity, economic prosperity by sustaining businesses, or even deploying continuously humanitarian aid while not challenging the broader the overarching structure, the overarching illegality of the occupation. This is extremely problematic. It means kicking the can in the air without solving the problem once and for all. And it's extremely cynical and sadistic toward the Palestinians.
So turning again to the occupation and on a related but different subject than of your report, yesterday, you called upon the United Nations to publish an updated list of companies conducting business with illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, basing your demand on United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016, which calls upon UN member states to pursue the principle of distinction in their dealings between Israel and the occupied territories. Can you explain the significance of this issue and why you consider it important that this list be published in an updated form?
Yes, so let me clarify for the benefit of the audience who might not be fully familiar with the issue I tackle in the report. So there is a web of national, but also international businesses which operate in the Palestinian territory illegally. because the legality of the occupation is such that it radiates to any other manifestation. So these businesses not only field-proof military equipment on the Palestinians, exploit all resources from the water, the Nile to and diverted from Palestinians, the farm and graze land, quarry for stones, extract mineral and drill oil and other natural resources, gas, etc. These are resources that are allocated, should be allocated to the Palestinians, and instead they are allocated almost for exclusive benefit of the colonies and the occupying power. Now, there is an obligation to label these products as from the occupied Palestinian territory that is being adopted in a number of countries, including in the European Union. But this doesn't resolve the legality of trading settlement products. This, just as I write in the report, this puts the burden of complying with international law from the states to the consumers of these receiving states, which should be the one who have to decide on products that shouldn't be allowed in their territories in the first place. Now, because the situation is so serious, I recalled a recommendation to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to update the list, to update the database that is already produced, because there is a Human Rights Council resolution of, I think it's 2016 or 2008, I think it's 2016, which required the Office of the High Commissioner to produce this database and to keep on updating it. It has been produced after many years and a painful process, because of course there were pressures, enormous pressures on the Office of the High Commissioners not to proceed with it. Courageously, the Office of the High Commissioners did it, but then it stayed there. It is to be updated and it is to be looked at, because it also entails private businesses' responsibilities vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and responsibilities that can be looked at and addressed in their respective constituencies and states.
But you raise a very interesting point, which is that in publishing this kind of information, the responsibility for complying with international law, which, as you point out, should be first and foremost, of course, with the occupying power, secondly, with other states and governments, is effectively being shifted to the consumer. And that's because these products, even if properly labeled, are still permitted access to these consumer markets.
Correct. There is also another element that is not discussed in the report, but there has been such a dismissal of such a vast campaign of misinformation around the question, the reality that the Palestinians experience under occupation, that I think also the consumers are not necessarily aware of how serious their purchase is. But again, I don't think that the burden should be on them. European markets shouldn't accept these products in the first place, because
even if properly labeled.
Yes, the labeling, in my view, in my reading of international law, is not enough, because if Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory constitute a grave breach of humanitarian law. They constitute
so you're basically suggesting that settlement products should have a status similar to, let's say, blood diamonds, and simply be banned as a matter of principle.
They should be banned, not as a matter of law.
Yes,
as a matter of international law, because otherwise, it's inconsequential. The settlements constitute a war crime. Can you profit from a war crime? No, it doesn't make sense, right?
That's very clear. And finally, Francesca, you alluded to this a little earlier with your discussion of the legacy of British colonial legislation and mandatory Palestine, but Have you chosen a theme for your next report?
Yes, I'm already working on my second report, which is going to be about the deprivation of liberty in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the reason why I decided to focus on this theme is because of the numbers. There are thousands of Palestinians currently in Israeli jails, and about 80% is detained outside of occupied Palestinian territory, which is in breach of international humanitarian law, on top of the problems with the normative system that leads them. As I was saying before, the framing of what constitutes an offense, and the fact that many of the inmates are children, and many of the inmates are detained without charges based on secret evidence and without even getting into the custodial regime and the violations of prisoners' rights documented by Palestinians and Israeli organizations, which are doing a terrific job. So I think that it's my responsibility to look at the reality on the ground, elevate the call for scrutiny that comes from the Palestinians, the Israeli civil society, the Palestinian under occupation themselves. And it's also something that is due to those under occupation, because again, there is my sense from what I got from my early consultations with Palestinians and Israeli civil society is that, I mean, they are encouraging me not to look at the black letter of international law, but also interpret how the occupation as a whole is a form of deprivation of liberty, and it's incompatible with freedom of movement and other freedoms. So this is what I'm going to work on for the next report.
Francesca Albanese, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections.
Thank you very much, Mouin.